Hello and welcome to the Bridgerland Technical College PVC lab demonstration. To begin any lab, you want to make sure you have the right tools. We're doing a PVC lab, so we'd want to use a hacksaw or some PVC cutters. You'd also want to make sure to bring a reamer so that you can clean off any of those burrs, especially if you're using a hacksaw. Now, the state test does require that you ream, and really any assembly does, but that state test will check to see if you have reamed, so you want to make sure to do that with each cut as you go along through your project. Now let's talk for a minute about fitting allowances. A fitting allowance is the amount of space that's taken up by the fitting itself. So we have an end to center or center to center measurement, and this space is taken up by the fitting. So we have to subtract that from our cuts. Manufacturers, as they create fittings, often have a seam. If you trace those seams, then you can create an intersection point that helps us to see a little better where that center to center or end to center measurement would be. So that's something you might try as you begin your assembly. Now when it comes to that takeoff or fitting allowance, you could use a measuring tape, and this one looks like about 3/4 of an inch. So you could take your measurements and subtract that. Or for our purposes, as we assemble the project today, we're just going to begin by gluing things together. So for example, we have the base here. We're going to start with a cap. When we glue this cap on, that cap is going to go onto the pipe as far as it will go. The cap also has a fitting allowance, but rather than subtract for that fitting allowance, we're just going to push the pipe together, get that cap on exactly where it's going to go, and then we're going to measure from the end of that cap to subtract that fitting allowance or include that fitting allowance. We'll just measure from the end of it using a framing square. This is where the framing square really helps with accuracy. We can take the cap, push it up against the side of the square, and then mark on our pipe exactly where the end to center measurement is supposed to be. Checking the measurements from our plan there, we'll mark a line where that measurement should be. Now that should be the center of the T, end of the cap to the center of the T. So if we line that up with our T now, we can see a little better where this pipe is going to end inside the fitting. We know where the end of the fitting is. We know about where the end of the cup inside the fitting is, and I'm going to mark that. That's going to be where we cut it, not the center line, but the cut line. You don't want to confuse those as you're making your cuts, but this gives us a fairly accurate position for cutting. Now when I cut, I actually come back about 1/8 of an inch, giving it just a little bit less. Especially with PVC, this makes it easier on assembly, because when I do glue these together and push the pipe all the way into the fitting, if I'm a little bit short, I can always adjust it back out. If I'm a little bit long, it's a little bit more difficult because I have to pull it apart to make my cut. So at this point, once I've pushed it together, I'm going to double check, triple check, and adjust it as I go. If I try and do this later, it's going to be too late. Every 1/8 of an inch counts, so I'm taking the time to make sure that I get my measurements correct as we go along. Now I'm working on the other side of the base. Again, we'll glue on the cap, make sure that it's tight, and in the same way, push it up against the side of the square, mark where our center line should be, that's the center of the T. Then we're going to mark again where the pipe should end inside that fitting, and we'll just cut it off right there, a little bit shy of our mark. Once we've got our cut, we're ready to glue it together again. Now you'll notice that I'm not taking the time to subtract 3/4 of an inch or calculate. What I'm doing is a visual fitting allowance with a takeoff on the pipe, and then making adjustments as we go. This is a method that increases speed quite a bit when it comes to the creation of these projects. Now I'm testing it, checking it, and adjusting it because I want it to be exact, right to the 1/8 of an inch. It takes a few tries sometimes. You can see that by adjusting it, we can get it right where we need it to be. With that, the base is about ready, and we'll set it aside so that we can begin the next portion. Now, when it comes to assembling, it's helpful to put pieces together in anything that would be on a flat plane. So we've got the base. What we're going to do now is build up the male adapter and the 90. We're going to split this project into 3 separate pieces, assemble those pieces, and then fit them together. So in similar fashion, I've glued the male adapter on. Rather than worry about fitting allowance, I've just pushed it on exactly where it's going to go. I'm going to mark where it should be on the center of that fitting. I'm going to check with my fitting and then mark where the cut would be. With this, I can cut the pipe back, again just going a little bit shy of my mark, prepare it with the reamer, and glue it into the 90. Once this is assembled, we'll move on to the piece on the other side of the 90, but I'm not going to glue any fitting on it. We'll just kind of get it ready, and then we'll set this section aside. Similarly, just going to glue this right onto the 90. Then we'll measure back to where the center should be and cut the pipe. Now this time I'm actually setting the center of the pipe over the end, the edge of that framing square. So I'm not pushing it against the side of the square, I'm actually setting it over it and watching that my center lines up. This way I can still mark my center line, mark my fitting cut, and then get right in and cut it. At this point, that 90 is ready. I'm going to set it aside. Now, this PVC project has an offset. That means there's a 45-degree coming off of the base, and then after it's kind of risen vertically, it's going to level out horizontally. We're doing the same thing with this 45, marking the seam lines and finding the center point for our measurements. With that, I can set that center line on the square and find my measurement. There's the center measurement for the T, but I don't want to cut it there. Again, that T has a fitting allowance, so we're going to mark about where we want to cut it on the pipe. We've set the base aside, now we're gluing onto the other side. You'll notice I'm not gluing things together in a linear fashion, say from the base on. Again, we're building this in sections. We have the one pipe coming off of the T. This is the horizontal coming away from the 45. We've marked the center. Then we'll mark the cut. And we're ready to go. The 45 and the 90, and it comes down to just a matter of gluing them together. We'll put this 45 piece into the T, making sure that we have the base oriented the correct way. One side of the base is longer than the other. If I flip that around and glue it on incorrectly, I fail the project entirely. I'm going to take a minute and make sure that it looks square. Make adjustments as I go, and then check measurements as I go. Now as I check this with the square, I set it on the center line of the T. It's a little hard to see, but I could tell that I was about, after adjustments, 1/8 of an inch off. So I've decided that it's worth the time to cut it off. I'm using a hacksaw because sometimes it's hard with those PVC cutters to get in and shave off 1/8 of an inch. If this was long, and especially with that piece coming up on an offset, if I leave it long, that one measurement that's 1/8 of an inch off is going to affect the overall height, and it's going to basically affect other measurements. So now I've corrected that, glued it back in, double checking center to center measurements from the T to the 45, and we're accurate. So now we're going to piece together the last portion. On this one I'm going to glue both sides of that 90 at the same time, and then we're going to need to twist it, arrange it, square it, and get it exactly where it needs to go. There should be enough time to take care of that as I push the fitting together. Now I put it on backwards. We'd always want to make sure that it's coming up on the correct side. You can see here. We're going to move it around, make sure that we're coming on the right as the plan shows. Now I take a minute to let that set so it doesn't pull apart, but I'm definitely going to be checking all measurements on the 90 and to the end. At this point, I'm going to take that square and I'm going to check measurements on the base, the 45, all the way through the 90, and checking the overall measurement from the table up. Now you might use bricks or blocks to get it up, position it so that you don't have to hold it. But it's that final check of accuracy that's going to make all the difference when we hand that in and get a grade from the state test.